So now I'm joined by Dr. David Bowtell, and I'm sorry, I called you Botwell, and I seem to be on a roll.
A lot of people do.
Do they?
Yeah.
They always mix up the W
It's
and the T.
very common.
Well, Miss Dr. Bowtell, tell us about, you have a long list here. I will let you do the honors of telling us, what you do and where your research happens.
So I'm located at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne, in Australia, and that's Australia's oldest and largest dedicated cancer centre. There's about 500 researchers there. It's also a hospital, so there are inpatients and many, many outpatients, and there's really wonderful integration between the lab and the clinic at Peter Mac. So at Peter Mac, I'm head of the Cancer Genomics and Genetics program. I was previously director of research, so I'm sort of doing the reverse in my career. I'm going progressively back to the lab, actually, after having a very significant leadership role there. I'm also fortunate to be head of the Australian Ovarian Cancer Study. So this is a study of about 3,000 women who have had ovarian cancer, and we've recruited them to the study since 2001. And we've followed their cancer journey and collected biospecimens from them, blood samples for genetic testing, and particularly tumour samples, to try and understand what it is about the cancer that makes it particularly aggressive in some women or in other women who survive a long time. So AOCS is probably the largest ovarian cancer cohort study in the world now, and what really distinguishes it is the depth of clinical information that we have from the patients.
That's really interesting. So have you guys found what those differences might be so far?
So the study has a lot of different goals. When it was first established from a program grant by the US Department of Defense, that created us back in 2001. And at that time we had three major goals. So one of them was that we wanted to find genes associated with the risk of developing ovarian cancer. The second one was to really pull apart the biology of the cancers and understand what made them tick, why some cancers didn't respond to initial treatment, how other cancers evolved resistance to treatment. So things about the biology of the cancers, particularly in the context of patient outcome. And then the third thing was to understand the impact of lifestyle, co-medications, epidemiological factors that influence the development of cancer and how women fared with cancer. So really three major goals for the study. And AOCS, since it has been created, has in the end enabled over 100 projects in 7 countries around the world.
Wow.
It's had about 250 publications. It's part of many different consortia. It's a global effort. Fortunately, research in ovarian cancer and AOCS is part of that global effort.
So you mentioned this global effort, and cancer has no boundaries. It has no borders. Right. So, we obviously focus and talk a lot about what happens at our own home here in the U.S., but can you tell us about some of the things that are going on, across the pond, on the other side of the world?
Right. Down under.
Down right. under, yeah, the land down under.
So, well, the first thing to say is that it is actually very well integrated, both from a clinical point of view and a research point of view, with what's happening in other parts of the world. And as we're discussing, every day pretty much we now have video conferences with our collaborators, particularly in North America, but also in Europe. So it is a very integrated effort. But there are a few things that we're doing that are a little bit unusual, I think. So maybe to mention 2 or 3 things. So one of them is, I think many people have heard about the importance of BRCA mutations and the importance of testing for those mutations, and increasingly now women are actually offered that testing, and that's integrated in clinical practice. But what we've realized as a result of our studies in Australia, and this is true for other countries, is that there are lots of women and their families who predated that increased appreciation of the importance of that testing. And they're out there, and it's there's no mechanism currently to find these, go out and proactively find these families if the woman's deceased or the individual if they're still alive. So we have a study called TraceBack, which is conceptually really simple, is to go and find these people before other cancers occur in the family, and to test whether a mutation is present, and if one is, to then make sure that information's communicated to the family, and cascade testing is performed, and people can take risk-reducing strategies before, unfortunately, another cancer occurs. And so back in May 2016, a group of us convened a meeting in Montreal as a satellite to the hereditary breast and ovarian cancer meeting that was being held. And we talked through the logistics of actually making TraceBack work. And out of that arose a publication that you can find in the Journal of Clinical Oncology. And that really talks about how you would go about doing something like TraceBack. And right now, Rachel Delahunty, who's a PhD student and a medical oncologist in my lab, is getting TraceBack underway in Australia in partnership with one of your sister organisations, Ovarian Cancer Australia. And we're going out and trying to find these people and trying to prevent these cancers. And we hope that what we achieve in Australia will provide some practical information about how you actually do this and roll it out in North America and in Europe. And we think that we could prevent many, many breast cancers and ovarian cancers by doing this. So that's one difference. At the other end of the spectrum, our lab has been, I guess, one of the leaders in the world of looking at acquired resistance in ovarian cancer. And we've mainly focused on the most common type of ovarian cancer, high-grade serous cancers. And we've been interested in understanding how, in a sort of a Darwinian sense, the cancer evolves in a sort of a sneaky way to go from being sensitive to treatment to being resistant. And really, we haven't understood that even though the drugs that are used now have been used for decades, we've had a very poor appreciation of that. And one of the things that's distinguished our work, I guess, is because of things like the Australian Ovarian Cancer Study, we've been able to recruit patients and collect samples from them both at the time when they were originally diagnosed and then if their disease has come back, and we can do this sort of before and after comparison to see what's changed. And we had a major paper published 2 years ago in Nature where we really started to, for the first time, pick apart in a systematic way different ways that the cancer could evolve treatment resistance. And so we've followed that now in a way that's a little bit confronting, but still very powerful, in that we've established, I think, the first rapid autopsy study in the world in ovarian cancer patients. And so this is a study to really understand what killed the patient. So, we know a great deal about the biology of the cancer when it's diagnosed, but we know very little about the biology of the cancer when it is starting to progress and at end stage, when it actually overwhelms the patient. And the rapid autopsy study, which is called Cascade, and that I lead, has really starting to give us insights into the nature of the cancer that actually kills the patient. And from that information, we hope that we can really start to have more informed approaches to treatment when the cancer comes back, the development of biomarkers, and ultimately develop strategies that overcome treatment resistance.
And that's really interesting, because that was going to be my next question. What were you guys hoping that information would be able to do? And what do you kind of foresee, how do you foresee that kind of evolving the treatment process if they are able to kind of answer those questions at that point?
Right. So I think there are a couple of things where it's clinically useful. So unfortunately, in ovarian cancer at the moment, we don't have laboratory tests that tell us what has occurred in the cancer in terms of it becoming resistant to treatment, and therefore which drug should be used next. They're called biomarkers, bio for biology, and markers from a diagnostic point of view. And so by deciphering these mechanisms of resistance, automatically you create biomarkers. Automatically you create biomarkers that a clinician could use to guide their treatment. So that's one of the things that's coming out of the work. The second thing is that once you understand the mechanisms, knowledge is power, right?
Right.
And so if you can understand how the cancer has evolved to evade treatment, then if there are drugs to that mechanism, then you can try to reverse it. So a good example of this is a protein or a gene called ABCB1. ABCB1. It's kind of a mouthful in a way. And it's a gene that was studied a great deal in the 90s and 2000s because it encodes a protein, proteins being the sort of the functional bit, the gene being like the blueprint. It encodes a protein that's a pump, a little tiny nano machine that sits on the surface of the cell, and it actually pumps drug out of the cell so that as the chemotherapy comes in, this pump is shoving it back out so that it allows the cell to resist the treatment. And so what we discovered is that in quite a high proportion of women with recurrent high-grade serous ovarian cancer, their cancer's undergone a very sneaky change where a very strong on switch, technically called the promoter, has been fused to this ABCB1 gene to ramp up the level of the protein, this protein pump that's on the surface of the cell. And so we find that this occurs in about 20% of women with recurrent disease. And in fact, for other reasons, we think that it's relevant in about nearly half of the patients with this. And so that, on the one hand, is giving us a biomarker that says when that's present, choose a drug that pump cannot utilize. So the pump can only be active against certain drugs. There are certain other drugs that in chemotherapies that are not substrates of that pump. So from a clinician's point of view, they should, when they're considering which drug the patient should go on to, they should choose one that the pump can't work on. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that there's actually a series of drugs that were developed in the 90s and 2000s and have been largely abandoned that are active against that pump. And what's new about our work is we've now identified the patients that really need that drug. And so what we've shown in cell lines that have been developed from patients with this active pump, that if you use that drug, you can actually reverse the resistance to chemotherapy. So we're now taking that forward into clinical trials as well.
Some really exciting stuff.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It gets me out of bed.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, especially when you're jet lagged. Yeah.
Well, you fly here often, right? So,
I do. Yeah.
Now, we understand that ovarian cancer is not a singular disease. Can you tell us about recent reclassification?
Okay, so the classification of ovarian cancer. So pathologists have known for a long time that ovarian cancer comes in different flavors, but from a clinical point of view, that to a large extent has been kind of ignored in the sense that, you know, there's been a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to the way that ovarian cancer patients have been treated. We now understand that really we should have paid more attention to the pathologists because serous cancers, for example, which are something that they see down the microscope in terms of a pattern of the cells, are very different to clear cell cancers, to mucinous cancers, and in fact, they're as different as breast cancer is to kidney cancer. And, you know, even though it seems kind of crazy, the term ovarian cancer is really kind of misleading.
Really? Why is that?
Well, on two fronts. It sort of makes it sound like it's one disease, and it really is not. And just in the sense that cancer is not one disease. It's breast cancer, kidney cancer, prostate cancer, and so on. But also, we now appreciate that the most common types of what we call ovarian cancer don't actually start in the ovary. They sort of, the ovary is like a kind of a grand central station for bad cells to show up and to grow. And so a more appropriate term would be pelvic cancers. So these are cancers that share an anatomical location in the body. But the name sort of belies the fact that they're really very distinct. And from what we now appreciate from a clinical point of view is that we need to take a much more nuanced approach to the way that cancers are treated, so that there are specific therapies for high-grade serous cancers, there are specific therapies for clear cell cancers, and so on. And so clinical trials now have responded to that, and the trials are designed to try and take that into account. It's important as well because if you treat everything as as a sort of a single entity, you lose, from a research point of view or from a clinical point of view, you lose signal. So for example, if a drug works in one particular type of ovarian cancer and you're trying to treat all the ovarian cancers, you'll miss that fact that it works.
Right, it's not
But if
cookie cutter.
Yeah, it's not going to be clear cut. But if you target it to a particular group of patients where you've got the best chance of seeing a response, then a drug that might have been discarded for not being effective will actually probably show a result. So taking this much more sort of directed approach, subsetted approach to ovarian cancer has made it a bit of a challenge in a sense, because it means recruiting to trials can be more difficult, particularly
right,
for the less...
because now you're having to actually pinpoint individual things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for the rarer types of ovarian cancer, that's quite a challenge. And so that's something that we as a community need to, as a research community, need to deal with. And the one way that we can deal with that is to make sure that we really combine our efforts in terms of being able to recruit patients to a combined trial, even across countries, in order to get sufficient numbers to move along the trials quickly.
So when a patient gets diagnosed with ovarian cancer, what should she know about the type of cancer she has and the associated implications, since you have kind of touched on the fact that like every cancer is not the same.
Right.
It's not all under one umbrella.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two really important implications. One is that the different types of ovarian cancer need different treatments, and that's a conversation that she needs to have with her clinician in terms of whether she's receiving a treatment that really is appropriate for her cancer, and whether there are clinical trials that are particularly appropriate for the type of cancer that she has. The second thing is that we know that genetic risk is not uniform across the different types of ovarian cancer, and the BRCA genes, which most people will be aware of, our work has shown that that's really, really mostly confined to high-grade serous ovarian cancers. And so that, you know, there are still errors in the pathological classification of cancers. And so in Australia, for example, the guidelines net in some other types of ovarian cancer that sometimes can be mistaken for high-grade serous cancers. So clear cell cancers are included, and endometrioid cancers are also included, so that if women have those types of ovarian cancer, they're still tested. But what we understand is that the risk is particularly associated with high-grade serous cancers, where the frequency of the mutation in population studies around the world in unselected populations, so without prior selecting them based on family history, the frequency of those germline mutations is somewhere between 15 and 17%. So actually, high-grade serous cancers are the most common, have the highest frequency of those mutations of any cancer.
So I understand you have an interest in long-term survivors. Can you tell us a little bit about that study?
Yeah, so these are women with high-grade serous ovarian cancer. That's a type of cancer that unfortunately has a pretty poor outcome in many cases. And so we've become very interested in these remarkable women who've managed to beat the odds. And so less than half patients might survive for 5 years with high-grade serous cancers. And so we've been very interested in patients who are still alive 10 years later, they clearly have this type of ovarian cancer. In many cases, they've had early clinical management which would suggest that they might not do very well. For example, their surgery, even though the standard of the surgery was very high, it was not able to remove all of the cancer, and yet they've still survived for more than 10 years. And so we've just, the paper will appear in a few weeks' time, our first analysis of the wiring of these cancers and what might make them tick. And we find that there's a particular group of these patients that we call the one and dones. So they have had their surgery, and then they've had their chemotherapy, their first line of chemotherapy. And whereas in many patients the cancer will go away for 12 months or 18 months or 2 years, in these patients it just goes to ground and it stays. And it stays away, and it doesn't come back 10 years later. It still hasn't come back. And so they're really remarkable. And the particularly interesting ones are the ones where we know they haven't been cured surgically. So that there's been residual cancer that couldn't be removed at the end of surgery, and yet the cancer's been eradicated, appears to have been eradicated in these patients.
Now, a lot of people would call that a miracle. What would you say is, I mean, or have you guys kind of come to find what the science behind it actually is?
Yeah, so we think we have a handle on what's going on. So we would call it a jackpot, a lucky jackpot from the patient's point of view.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, the sort of the poker machines, right? So every time a cancer is formed, it's like the cell has cranked the wheel, and the dials have spun, and instead of a lemon, an orange, and a grape,
you got all sevens.
Well, up has come a mutation in this gene, and a mutation in this gene, and a mutation in this gene, and there's a sort of a combination that allows that cell to become a cancer, if you like. And so what happens, and those events are somewhat correlated, but largely randomly associated, so like a poker machine. But what happens in some patients is that a combination comes up that makes the cancer exquisitely sensitive to chemotherapy, so much more sensitive than it normally would be. And this is what's in this paper, and we show that there's a particular combination of mutations that seems to make the cancer like one of these one and dones, where it's just blitzed by the chemotherapy and really has a hard time coming back. And so what we're hoping to learn from these long-term survivors is information that we can then apply to more typical patients to make partially sensitive cancers into these really extremely sensitive cancers to chemotherapy. So it's an international consortium. It's called MOCOG. It's led by Lee Pierce and Malcolm Pike from here in the United States, where I lead up one of the three arms of that on the genomic analysis of the cancers. It involves researchers in Australia and in the UK and in the United States. I'm proud to say that Australia is the biggest single contributor to the long-term survivor study in terms of contributing patients, these very rare patients, through the Australian Ovarian Cancer Study. But it's very much an international effort, and really we're looking at three main things. One's to do with the genes that the patient's born with and the genetic changes in the cancer, so stuff around genes. And the second thing is led by Brad Nelson over in BC in Canada, and he's looking at the immune response that occurs in the patients and how the immune system is actually able to recognize the cancer and hold it at bay. And we think that that's important in a different group of long-term survivors, the ones where the cancer sort of goes away for 5 years and then it comes back and they have some more treatment and it goes away for a long period of time. We think that there's a strong contribution from the immune system in helping, as well as the chemotherapy, in helping keep the cancer at bay. So genes, immune system, and then the third part is to really look at things that the patient might be doing. So what's the impact of diet and exercise? We're actually asking these long-term survivors, how do you think you beat the odds? What did you do? They might know something that we don't know.
Right.
And and so there's a whole study around lifestyle and epidemiological factors.
Was there anything found?
So we're right in the midst of it at the moment, and we've managed through the consortium to recruit 1,800 patients. So that's an extraordinary number. 600 short-term survivors, 600 medium-term survivors, and 600 of these very precious long-term survivors, because you need to be able to compare one with the other. And so we're right in the midst of analysing the data, and
that's really exciting.
I'm
like really
exciting.
Curious to know like what it is now.
I know.
I'm hoping it's ice cream and pizza every week. I'm hoping that's
lots
the
of
secret.
chocolate.
Yeah, that's the secret.
Right. Yeah. So it's I think it's a wonderful study because, so often we're confronted with the grim reality of this disease, and we need to be reminded of the fact that there are some patients who beat the odds, and that we can learn from these sort of experiments of nature in a way, these remarkable women that could probably teach us something about how
we can hit the jackpot.
How we can hit the jackpot with more patients. Yeah,
of course.
Absolutely.
Well, okay, that's really exciting stuff. I'm I'm feeling excited, and I'm definitely like really looking forward to when the publication comes out. And you said it's coming out when again?
I think in the next few weeks. So it's
Okay.
in press now.
Great.
So it'll be in Clinical Cancer Research.
So, Doctor, then I would like you to deliver one message to our community of survivors then, as far as what they can do, or what your message is to them who are currently undergoing treatment for ovarian cancer.
Right. Can I deliver two messages?
Please, deliver all the messages.
Okay, so I'll reinforce the message, which I think you'll have heard from other people, about the importance of genetic testing. We know that that's something that we can do to modify the risk in your sisters and daughters and nieces, and it also has relevance to the men in the family as well. So don't rely on family history. Our study back in 2012 showed that nearly half the patients who carried these mutations didn't have sufficient family history to actually trigger genetic testing. So now in Australia, that as a criteria to be offered genetic testing has been abandoned. So if you've had ovarian cancer, have a conversation with your clinician about whether you should have genetic testing if you haven't had that done so far. If you're the next of kin, or if you're a family member of a woman with ovarian cancer who's deceased, that also can be a conversation that you have with the clinicians, your doctor or the clinician that treated your relative. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is to be hopeful. We know that this is a disease that has a pretty bleak outcome, but we also know that there are people that beat the odds. And it's a curve, right? So there are the majority of people who might fit into the middle of the curve who don't survive their disease or don't survive it or are not cured of their disease. But there are also people who are out on the tail, and that's unpredictable as to who they will be. And so there is always hope that people will be in that group. And the other thing, the reason why I think there's hope is that if this is a curve of numbers versus length of survival, and there are obviously people out here, this curve is tracking to my right. In other words, what happened 5 years ago is different to what happens now.
Right.
And the way that I like to think about it is the progress of the next 5 years will be like the progress of the last 20 years, because the clouds have sort of parted in terms of this disease. We have a much better idea of what we're up against. And in the immortal words of Sun Tzu, the author of The Art of War, you have to know your enemy. And if you know the enemy, then you don't need to fear the outcome of the battle. But if you don't know the enemy, you'll be defeated every time. And I think what's changed in ovarian cancer is we know the enemy a lot better now. And so I think that there is a bright future in terms of improvement in outcome for women with this disease and in prevention of the disease in their relatives. And we've seen that in the registration just in the last, almost on an annual basis, of the registration of a new drug in ovarian cancer just in the last couple of years. And of course, the other sort of really game changer in cancer generally has been in immunotherapy. And that's had unbelievably transformative effect in disease like melanoma, where patients with advanced disease who 5 years ago really there would have been almost nothing to offer them, are now probably between a third, maybe 40% will likely be cured of their disease through immunotherapy. And we don't know whether ovarian cancer is going to fall into the same sort of optimistic space, but we know that there are a group of patients with high-grade serous cancers, for example, where there is an immunological response, quite a profound immunological response to the cancer. It's not enough to overwhelm it, but it's certainly holding it partially in check. And so there's good reason to believe that in those patients particularly, that the immunotherapies are likely to have a substantial impact. And in fact, we've got a clinical trial that will be starting in January next year, unique in the world, funded through Genentech, a large biotech in the Bay Area in San Francisco, where I spent many years. And that trial is targeted, it's right on that theme we were talking about before. It's targeted at a specific subset of high-grade serous cancer patients, so a subset within a subset, and it combines immunotherapy with small molecule inhibitors. So it's a very exciting space, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, I really do think that just you and all of the other medical experts and researchers that are out there doing these studies and finding out this new information, that in itself is a reason to keep hope, because we're like in a new age now. We're finding out just in this sitting alone.
Right.
We heard this brand new information, and it seems to be the accumulation of information is just growing as time passes.
Yeah, like I said, knowledge is power, and I think the world is accelerating so fast in so many different ways. Artificial intelligence.
Yeah, you visit the U.S. 3 times a week now because
Zoom.
of video.
Yeah, it's like the world has just shrunk.
Right.
And we collaborate with so many people here and so on. So the next 5, you can't sort of say, well, that was 5 years ago. This is what it's like in 5 years' time. The next, the last 20 years, as I said, is going to be what we'll achieve in the next 5 years. That degree of change and development, I firmly believe that.
Yeah, large strides are definitely being made.
Yeah, definitely.
So one last message then, because your last message was really good. I liked it. I think you guys probably liked it too. So we know that ovarian cancer is a silent disease. It's not something you can just go and immediately get tested for in that sense. But what is a message you would have to those when it comes to ovarian cancer awareness?
Well, I think that obviously we've talked about the importance of genetic testing. That's critically important. But I think that we've seen a wonderful thing in breast cancer in the power of women as advocates for that disease, and it really has transformed the outlook for breast cancer. I mean, breast cancer has been radically transformed in terms of the survival statistics for it. And so advocacy for this disease has been difficult because we've not had, it's a less common cancer, and because it's more commonly fatal, we've had fewer advocates. But organizations like Ovarcome, in our country, Ovarian Cancer Australia, in the United States, in the UK, Ovarian Cancer Action, the EU Foundation, and so on. These are extremely important in terms of raising awareness, providing awareness to women, and also raising funds for research. I know it sort of sounds self-serving to be talking about funding, but this stuff
I mean, that's where these strides are happening, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And at the moment in Australia, the success rate for peer-reviewed grants is running around about 10%. And so that means for every 100 grants that get written by researchers, only 10 get funded. Researchers always have more ideas than there's funding available, but I can tell you, having sat on many of these panels, a lot of great science is not getting funded. And advocacy groups can be very important in terms of in providing those funds, and particularly providing funds for risky research, and that normally wouldn't get funded through the rather sort of safe mechanisms that often occur for other peer-reviewed schemes. And what that can enable you to do is to get the key preliminary data to demonstrate that your idea has merit, and then be much more successful in terms of the chances of getting peer-reviewed funding. So get out there and raise awareness for the disease. Be aware of your own situation. Advocate for yourself, I think, and make sure that you're getting the treatment you need, that it's focused on the type of cancer that you have, and be optimistic.